Hi everyone, and welcome to this Foundation Years video podcast. Our goal with this podcast is to cover issues that we know are of real importance to the early years sector. Therefore, the main focus of this podcast is the disapplications to the early years foundation stage that have just come into force, and in particular, the requirements relating to paediatric first aid. We will also try to cover some of the questions you have around personal protective equipment for early years professionals, because we know this is on everyone's mind. We know these are issues that you wanted further guidance on, so we hope we will be able to get you the answers you need. If you could move on the slide, please. So, my name is Matthew Dodd and I'm Head of Policy at the National Children's Bureau. I'm delighted to be chairing this vodcast today. I'm joined by Ada Simpson, Head of Early Years Quality at the Department for Education. Ada will be delivering a presentation on the Early Years Foundation Stage disapplications during the COVID-19 outbreak. We will have two Q&A breaks where we will put the questions you have submitted through the Foundation Years inbox to Ada. The questions we have received come from both providers and from local authorities. Where Ada has covered the questions in her presentation, we won't ask her to repeat herself, but we will aim to make sure that all of your questions have been answered one way or the other. If you're watching this vodcast and you're not already a member of the Foundation Years community, then please visit the website to sign up. You'll receive updates on future vodcasts as well as regular news from DFE and elsewhere. Before we begin on the policy detail, I want to take this opportunity to express our thanks for all your hard work and dedication to keeping early years provision open for the children of key workers and vulnerable children during this hugely challenging time for all of us. Your role has been absolutely central to the national response to COVID-19, and we do understand the challenges you are facing. We also want to recognise the hard work and commitment of officials in the Department for Education and across government who are working flat out to provide you with the clarity that you need. So, a quick word about NCB. As the Department for Education's Early Years Stakeholder Engagement Partner, NCB runs the Foundation Years communication channels to keep you up to date with the latest policy developments and provide you with opportunities to share your views and questions with DFE. You can follow us on Twitter, sign up to our community on the Foundation Years website, and join our free regional Learn, Explore, Debate events once they're up and running, probably in the autumn. NCB is a champion for early years professionals and the great work that you do. A key part of our role is to understand the challenges you are facing and to help DFE give you the information you need. So, without any further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Ada Simpson from the Department for Education. Following this podcast, if anything is not clear, you can submit further questions to the Foundation Years inbox, and Ada has agreed to work on some answers. I'll rejoin you all once Ava has done the first part of her presentation.
Brilliant, thank you, Matt. And to reiterate what you said about the role of the early years in all of this, and thank you to each and every person for your dedication and for everything you're doing to help the country get through what's an incredibly difficult time for all of us. Thanks also to local authorities for all the work that they're doing, as well as to charities like NCB. It really does matter that everyone's pulling together on these things. To say, before we sort of start on the EYFS disapplications, I wanted to make a couple of wider comments. A lot of people might already be aware of the guidance we have published on gov.uk. That's wider guidance for early years providers and settings, for those who have closed, as well as those who have remained open for children during this time. We realise there's a lot going on at this time. You know, there is a lot of detail in there. There's also a lot of links to other pieces of guidance and information, including on funding support as developments happen on those different things. You can find some links to the different pieces of guidance that you might not have already seen, but maybe have at the end of these slides. So I think we're on slide 4 of the pack. Matt's already said what we're trying to do today. And hopefully we were able to give you an understanding of the changes that have come into force on Friday the 24th of April, to help providers to stay open, to deliver quality and safe care for children, and to ease some of the pressures so that you can respond to changes you might have in your workforce or changes in demand from the children attending your setting. So hopefully we'll be able to cover that off. On slide 5, there's a bit of an introduction to what the early years foundation stage is. I won't recap about that, but I just wanted to say we really have been listening to what people have been telling us about the challenges they've been facing whilst trying to respond to COVID-19. And that is why we've taken the decision to temporarily change some parts of the early years foundation stage statutory framework. So if we move on to the next slide, just to recap who this is for, it's for everyone where the EYFS applies. The guidance notes that it will be available to you will also make this really clear as well, and we can make sure NCB have that to circulate too for ease. So I thought it'd be helpful before we get into what the changes are and why, to talk a bit about when the changes apply. To be clear, these are temporary changes. They come into force on the 24th of April, and they won't be in place any longer than they need to be. For people who might have seen what's in the legislation, you might have noticed the long end date of the 25th of September. Just to clarify that that is connected with the wider Coronavirus Act 2020, which brought in different powers for responding to coronavirus, and that's the review date for those. So it could well be that we lift these changes to the EYFS sooner than that date. I mean, there is also a potential to extend. But the government will only make decisions like that when there's wider decisions on lifting the social distancing measures based on medical and scientific advice. Also to say that there will be a transitional period on the qualification requirement that we are amending. That's to recognise that for those providers who've been open for some or all of the COVID-19 outbreak, that there might be some challenges in getting back up to your usual staffing levels. So there'll be a 2-month grace period, as it were, to give you time to get back to where you should be to meet the usual staffing qualification requirements. We will make sure that providers know what's happening and when, with these things being lifted and going back to normal. Moving on to the next slide. I'm going to be talking about some different terminology here that might not be very obvious for people. One of the terms is reasonable endeavours and the other is best endeavours. We have used reasonable endeavours for most of the changes that we are making to the EYFS, and that's to set out that it will be great if settings can still aim to meet these things if possible, but we have used best endeavours for the change to paediatric first aid. I'll come on in a moment to what the changes are, as I said, but to say that best endeavours is really quite a higher level of requirement and duty than reasonable endeavours. So for best endeavours, we really are looking for settings to be able to demonstrate that they have taken all steps within their power to try to meet that requirement. And so really in using the two terms, we want to make it really clear that best endeavours is the one where we want to focus people's energies the most. Moving on to the next slide, we're going to start to talk about what the changes actually are. So in EYFS section 1, that's about the learning and development requirements and the educational programmes. Normally settings would be required to meet these, but for the period of COVID-19, instead we're saying that this is something that providers should use their reasonable endeavours to meet. So the guidance note will set out a bit, as in these slides, about what this means in practice, what we're expecting to happen, to give you a bit more information about what we mean. I should also have said at the start that Ofsted have worked with us on all of these changes, and so they know what will be changing, they know what will be different, and they'll be responding accordingly, so don't worry about that. Moving on to the next slide is about section 2 of the EYFS, which covers assessment. We are not going to be requiring providers to undertake the progress check at age 2 during the COVID-19 outbreak. So normally that would happen when a child is between 2 and 3, and we are saying that during this period that doesn't need to be happening. But when the measures are lifted, if it's possible, then it still makes sense to try and do that progress check for children that remain under 3. And of course, there'll be some judgment calls for settings to take here. Moving on to the next slide. So the next part of assessment is about the early years assessment foundation stage profile. You might have heard the announcement from the Secretary of State a couple of weeks back that said that there will be no exams or assessments in schools for this academic year. So they won't be taking place this summer. So that means that settings do not have to assess children against the early learning goals in the way they normally would, mainly for schools here, obviously. And accordingly, there will be no need to send that data into local authorities, and local authorities will not need to do any moderation. We have said that some settings, some schools might feel that they are able to assess children and that that's appropriate and manageable. And in those circumstances, they can do that. But again, they don't need to share that data. They might want to share that data with parents if they have done it, but there's no requirement to share it with local authorities. So those are the first sort of set of changes on the EYFS, and I think we're having a Q&A break before we move on to the really detailed stuff in section 3 of the EYFS.
Thank you, Ada, for that really clear explanation of the first part of the changes. The first question was around an assurance that the changes would last no longer than necessary, but you've really categorically stated that already. So I won't ask you to repeat yourself there. You'd mentioned that where a child when the temporary measures are lifted, there would be an expectation that anyone who was between 2 or 3, the progress check should still be completed before the child's 3rd birthday. Where the children have turned 3, would there be an expectation that the progress check was completed, or would you encourage it even if it's not expected?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it might be that it's not appropriate once they've turned 3, and settings will have to take some judgment calls on what's appropriate and what's not. At this point, we're not giving any clear recommendation to do that or not do that, but we'll plan to try and give some advice when we know more about when and how settings will return to normal.
Brilliant, and I think that appropriate test is a good one to use. And if they did feel it was appropriate, even though they're not required to, could they undertake one of the checks for children between 2 and 3?
Yes, they could do. I mean, if there are children still attending settings and would normally be about to receive that check, then yes, they can. For other children, obviously, who aren't attending settings at the moment, that might be more difficult, but that's a decision settings can take.
Brilliant. Just going on to the teaching and learning requirements, just for the avoidance of doubt then, a question. This applies to schools as well as early years providers?
Yes, yeah, that's right. So it applies to everybody who would normally be subject to the EYFS, so that includes reception year at school. I quite often get into the habit of referring to settings to generally mean all EY providers, but yes, schools too.
Brilliant. And in terms of end of year reports for individual children, not the EYFSP, would there still be an expectation that they were completed in some form? And if so, do you have any thoughts or guidance on what should be in them?
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think again, this is something that settings are not required to do, but they can choose to do. And they'll want to think about what's proportionate at the moment for their own capacity, as well as for the children who are either still attending or perhaps at home. And they could think about, where the children were at before lockdown or where they're at now if they're still attending, and think about what sort of development activities might help those individual children whilst they remain at home. So what are the sorts of things that parents could be doing with them, and the sorts of materials like Hungry Little Minds that's funded by the DfE, what sorts of things could help them at home. or what sorts of things might help when they return to the setting.
Brilliant. And the final question for this part: in the absence of moderation visits and local authority cluster meetings, would you be encouraging schools or settings to sort of pair up and do some quality control that way?
As there's no requirement to do the EYFSP this year, there isn't a requirement to moderate. If some schools felt that that would be useful and they wanted to pair up locally to do that, then that is absolutely fine. You know, obviously in this sort of socially distanced way that we have to do these things now, but yeah, they could choose to if they want to.
All right, fantastic. Well, that was the first round of questions. So back to you, Ada.
Okay, great. So moving on to the next slide. So we're going to talk a bit about the changes to the third section of the EYFS. I'm going to talk you through the modifications that we are making and to say that the rest of the EYFS remains in force. We have already set out in our guidance some of the existing flexibilities in the EYFS. So just to highlight that that includes flexibility on ratios, and in paragraph 3.30, it sets out that exceptionally there can be some changes to ratios already, so long as settings are always making sure that children are safe. So to say that we don't need to be making any amendment to that because the existing flexibility should be sufficient. Moving on to the next slide is something that gets a bit more technical and detailed, and some of that's here and I won't talk through all of it. So we're making some exceptions to the staff qualification requirements for the COVID-19 period and also for that 2-month transitional period that I mentioned at the start. So that's a change to the qualifications that staff need to hold in order to be counted into the ratio requirements. We're asking that providers will use their reasonable endeavours to try and meet the requirements that at least half of staff, excluding any managers, hold at least a full and relevant level 2 qualification to be counted into the staff and child ratios, but this won't be a legal requirement. We spoke earlier about the difference between reasonable and best endeavours, and this one is a reasonable endeavours requirement. The guidance note will set out more detail on this for people as well. Moving on to the next slide. So paediatric first aid is one of the issues that we've heard loudly and clearly has been a real challenge for many settings, particularly schools, in terms of staying open and providing safe care for children during COVID-19. So I'd like to say thanks to everybody who's escalated this, as well as all the other issues to us, and explain to us what you think would be good ways of handling this and what to do. So I'm pleased to be able to say that we can make this change and that we do feel confident that these changes can be done whilst ensuring children are kept safe, providing that settings do follow the requirements that are going to be set out. So most of the changes I've mentioned already are sort of relaxing of existing requirements, whereas this one is a relaxing of some parts of the requirement and putting in place different requirements instead. So I'd really urge settings, schools, local authorities to familiarise yourself with what these requirements are if it looks like you're having any challenges with paediatric first aid. So to tell you a bit about what the changes are in order to give more flexibility so settings can stay open. There's a statutory requirement in the EYFS that means that whenever usually there are children aged 0 to 5 on the site, that there must always be somebody with a full and current paediatric first aid certificate on the premises at all times to make sure that they have the specific first aid knowledge for young children. We are saying that for the period of COVID-19, this will need to remain in place where children are on site aged below 24 months. So 0 to 24 months, that requirement doesn't change. We're also saying that it doesn't change for childminders because they must already have a full PFA certificate and so must childminder assistants. Where the change comes in is if you have children aged 2 to 5 on site and no children aged under 24 months, then instead of being required to have that PFA person on site, then instead we're asking that you use best endeavours to make sure you have someone on site. So we were talking a little bit earlier about what we mean by best endeavours, and we mean that we want you to identify and take all possible steps to get somebody with PFA on site at all times. And in the guidance note, we'll set out a bit more of that, and I'll come on to a bit more of that in a minute actually. But to be clear that we're saying that if you've exhausted all possible measures and you absolutely cannot manage to have somebody with PFA on site at all times, then we're saying that instead of that, it will now be a statutory requirement that you must, 1, carry out a written risk assessment, and 2, ensure that somebody who has a current first aid at work certificate is on site, or somebody who has a current emergency version of PFA certification. So I just wanted to really stress those things, because those two items will be statutory requirements if you can't get someone with PFA on site at all times. And settings and schools will know how to write the sort of risk assessment that needs to be done, and that will just need to be kept in the setting and able to be produced if needed. But Ofsted, DfE, we won't actually be checking those, but it's more for the setting to have satisfied themselves that they've looked at the issues for the children who are attending during COVID-19, and making sure that they have put plans in place to ensure that those children are safe and those staff are safe. So that's what the new requirement on paediatric first aid will be, where there are children aged 2 to 5 on site. On the next slide, I think slide 16, we've set out some of the things that we could suggest that you do to try and get someone with PFA on site. So these are some of the steps that you might want to try and follow under the best endeavours duty to try and get someone on site. So I won't go through all of that now, but those are some ideas. Moving on to the next slide after that, aside to that main change on PFA, we have also got a couple of other things to say on it too. So we are making an amendment to the EYFS temporarily to say that new entrants will not be required to undertake a full PFA course within their first 3 months in order to be counted into ratios. So normally that would be a requirement, but for this period it won't be. And on that side, we've also got the reminder about requalification training and certificates being extended for up to 3 months, which is already in our published guidance, but a reminder there as well. So on to the next slide. As I was saying before, all the other elements of safeguarding welfare requirements in the EYFS section 3 remain in force. Providers might find it particularly useful to think about their child protection arrangements during this time, to be thinking about how they support children, particularly vulnerable children who are attending, and what they need to do if those children aren't attending, and the guidance that's published already covers those things. So this is really just a reminder that those things remain in place, that there must continue to be a safeguarding designated lead, and that person should be available. So those are the changes that we are temporarily making to the EYFS, and that we really hope will help settings and schools to stay open and help them to feel confident that they are providing safe and suitable care during that time. And as I've said before, we'll make sure that the government is clear on when these changes will be lifted. I think that's what I wanted to say there.
Okay, thank you, Ada. Thank you for that really, really clear explanation of the expectations, I think in particular around best endeavours, and, you know, really trying absolutely everything you can before accepting that there wouldn't be someone with PFA present. So I think that was really, really helpful to get that emphasis from the department. So
I realise it's a bit technical and a bit jargonistic at points, but hopefully that is helpful for people.
Yeah, real life examples are always really good. So a few more questions. What advice would you give a school trying to borrow, I hope that doesn't mean poach, a paediatric first aider from an early years setting?
Yes, so we are actively recommending that settings look to do this, like, as you say, from closed settings or where people have spare capacity, ideally. I think the guidance note says a little bit more on this. They could look to find someone from local closed provision, nurseries or childminders. Childminders all have to have PFA, so there might be somebody there who has capacity. Obviously, it will be important to consider any arrangements around, whether staff have been furloughed by their employer and what have you. There might also be people available from the wider academy chain, if that's applicable, or from other local maintained schools. And what we've done is we've asked local authorities to help support settings in this. So if you are having trouble, please do get in touch with them. If they can help you, they will. They might not be able to. Also are reminded to think about other things as well, so just checking things like DBS, and we've published in guidance how some of the DBS stuff is working during the COVID period.
Okay, and now you sort of covered this, but it was a very specific question, so it's a chance to sort of reiterate some of the messages in a real world example. So we had a question from a primary school. They have 3 and 4-year-olds on site for some of the days, and they want to check that having someone with an emergency paediatric first aid certificate would be sufficient. But I guess the answer here is only if you have tried everything else.
Yes. Absolutely, yeah. So if the primary school had already exhausted all best endeavours to have someone with PFA on site, then yes, it's fine for them to follow those other requirements. And recapping that, it's mandatory that they would have either someone with first aid at work certification or someone with the emergency version of PFA on site, and also to do that written risk assessment as well. Also, just to say that I'm assuming there that they don't have any children aged 24 months or under on site, because if they did, then they would need to have a PFA person there anyway.
Brilliant. And you've already said as well that it goes up to the age of 5. So where the 3 and 4-year-olds weren't in school, but 5-year-olds were, the requirements would still be there.
Yeah, that's right. So those age groups that would normally be under the EYFS, so including reception year of school, would still be counted under the arrangements that we've made.
Thank you, Ada. And then a question. There's been a lot of other questions about insurance, but this is an insurance question specifically in relation to the disapplications. Is the expectation that providers need to contact their insurers to inform them about this? What do you think?
So we are working to provide an update about insurance in the next version of our wider early years guidance that's published on gov.uk that I keep mentioning. I think the quick answer is if you're following government guidance properly, then you shouldn't have a problem. The cover should stand, but as with these things, please check with your insurance company for certainty. Is what I'd say on that. I mean, I think generally, if you've relaxed your ratios in line with the existing flexibility in the EYFS, so being clear that that's for exceptional circumstances, you might have some days where things are a bit tighter and you know there's a slight variation, then those things shouldn't be a problem. But I do always think it's worth checking.
Thanks, Ada. Right, we've just got a final.
And sorry, Matt, I should also say that also applies. I mentioned there if people were following the existing EYFS, but I should also be clear that if you are properly following our modifications to the EYFS from the 24th of April, then we should hope that's also fine. But again, check.
Thanks, Ada. We've just got a final couple of questions we wanted to get in there while we had you here, and that's my 1-year-old shouting in the background now. If childcare is now taking place in a hub, what will the expectation around floor space be, particularly considering there's going to need to be a partitioned area for babies?
So the floor space requirements in the EYFS haven't changed. They remain as they were. And there is already a degree of flexibility in terms of when and how children can mix. So yes, there is still a requirement to have a separate area for babies. But when we've had our discussions with stakeholders about the plan changes, we've not actually had that coming up as a big challenge. So I think it seems that there's enough room there in terms of existing flexibility for people to feel that's covered. I mean, if NCB gets more questions in on that, or if settings or LAs have more questions or find that is a real trouble, then please let us know. We'd be keen to hear.
Okay, great.
Also pleased to hear your 1-year-old's views on our changes.
Yeah, she loves them. So social distancing and early years settings. Should settings be looking to look at their floor space? And then the big question, will they be required to wear PPE? And if so, will the government provide it?
So I'm not sure to what extent people are aware already, but there is guidance published on gov.uk about social distancing in educational settings and childcare settings. That link is again at the end of the slides, slide 20, I think. I mean, that guidance recognises, and I completely understand, social distancing measures are really hard with babies and young children. That's true. That's not an easy thing to get around. The guidance asks that people follow the other requirements around hand washing things in the settings more frequently, and those sorts of things. So I know that doesn't feel easy, but that's the guidance we should be followed. That guidance was published by DfE, but was very much informed by the medical and scientific advice from our colleagues at Public Health England. So that's the position at this time. That guidance also sets out that the position at this time is that early years providers do not need to wear PPE. And that's based on scientific advice as well, and that sets out that PPE is really for where there are people who are giving care and treatment to individuals who have COVID-19 or the symptoms of COVID-19. I mean, as you can imagine, the government is keeping PPE under review. I know it's something that's in the news all the time, so of course we are making sure we're keeping close watch on that, but that is the position at this point. I mean, also to say that if childcare settings, if schools and colleges weren't safe for staff, for the children of critical workers and for vulnerable children to be at, then they wouldn't be open. So they are safe places to be. We are asking people to follow the social distancing measures as much as can be done and not forget things like hand washing and to do all those things. So I know that doesn't necessarily give you all of the reassurances, but that is based on the scientific evidence, and that is the position. And I think it's important to remember that that's the point, that they are safe.
Ada, thank you. Thank you for that incredibly well-informed and detailed analysis of the EYFS disapplications. I suspect actually you may have written the guidance on that.
My team wrote it. I can't take the credit.
And also thank you for taking some of those wider questions. I think, we absolutely recognise, exactly, you can't provide all the answers right away. It's great that you were able to say what you were able to say. So thank you. Thanks also to everybody else, all of you, for listening and watching. Thank you for sending your questions in advance. As we mentioned at the beginning, if you want to ask any further questions of clarification from what you've heard today, we're accepting questions still in the foundation years inbox. There we've got everything. You've got these slides will be circulated to you, and you've got the foundation years email address there. So any questions for clarification, please do submit them. Again, just to remind you, if you're not a member of the Foundation Years community, visit the Foundation Years website and sign up. Keep talking to us. We are listening. The Department for Education are listening, and we will do our best to continue to bring you the information that you need to continue doing the absolutely brilliant job out there. So thanks everyone, and see you next time.